All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to class. I hope everyone had a great break last week, whatever that means for you, being productive, getting some rest, catching up on stuff, hanging out with family, not hanging out with family. Welcome back to class. You remember, it feels like just yesterday I was making the joke that the semester was almost over when we were in like mid-September, and now that joke has come to fruition. We are almost done with the semester. We only have a handful of classes left. We have 2 labs. Things are winding down, as I'm sure you all are acutely aware. So for us, this means we're going to wrap up a couple more systems here in lecture and cover a couple new systems in lab, and that's going to bring us straight home to the end of the semester. So today we're going to wrap up the immune system. We had just a brief outline of the immune system we began before break. We're going to get back into that today. And then we're going to start into the endocrine system, and we probably won't finish that today. We'll probably wrap that up on Wednesday. So our agenda looks like this. We're going to start off with a review question drawing. I know probably most of you spent the better part of your break making anatomical drawings in your sketchbook just to refresh your memory. So this will just be a rehash of what you were doing over last week. We'll finish the immune system, as I said. We'll start into the endocrine system. Our discussion of the endocrine system features 2 important celebrities that are close to my heart, Andre the Giant and Missy Elliott, and you'll see why when we get there. And then at the end of class today, I just want to review our upcoming schedule. We don't have too much left, as I said, and give you a few reminders with a ticket out today. Before we dive in, what questions do you have? Okay. Cool. So the immune system, remember that the immune system's overall job is to recognize foreign molecules. So that can take the form of living organisms like bacteria. It can be viruses, which are somewhere between living and not living. We won't get into that. Or other potentially harmful molecules. And it destroys them through a couple different responses. We have first these macrophages that are non-specific, that just go and gobble stuff up that's not good, to put it kind of broadly. And then we have lymphocytes, which respond to specific kinds of molecules. And we talked a little bit about those, both of those kinds of immune responses last week. But our focus for this unit is really on the anatomical structures associated with the immune system. So go ahead and take 2 minutes and draw and label these important lymphoid organs. I haven't talked about all of these in detail, but I did give you the overview of these on Friday. See how many you can name from memory, and then go back and consult your notes and see which of them you can remember off the top of your head and what you need your notes for. It's a good kind of study guide for you. We will upload an image of this at the end of class with your ticket out. Katie, you good? All right, it's most of you, I think, have drawn and labeled what you're gonna label. Let's just go ahead and walk through these. Just yell it out. What are these? Tonsils. Good. What's this guy? Thymus. Good. What's this guy? Spleen. That's a trickier one. We just call these aggregated lymphoid nodules. And then the last one there, what's that little guy? Appendix. Good. So you should have something that looks like this. And I'm going to walk through, we started talking, I think, did we talk a little bit about the tonsils on Friday? I don't remember if we got to that or not. No, we didn't. Okay. So we're just going to walk through these structures and give you a general outline of their location, their anatomy, and their function. So please make sure you know this diagram, know these major structures, and shortly you'll know what they do. So let's go ahead and start off with our tonsils. You've all heard about tonsils before. Your doctor checks these when you say ah. That's what one of the things they're looking for, because you can see them in the back of your throat there. And you probably know someone, hey, so that has had their tonsils removed at some point in their life. So these are small organs that are arranged in kind of a ring shape around the back of the throat. So if you were looking at someone's open mouth like this, looking right at you, this is where you would see those tonsils, roughly. And the tonsils are an example of what we call MALT. This is the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So lymphoid tissue, so it has a function in the immune system that is, as you would guess, associated with mucosa. We see these in the mucosa, in this case, of the lining of your oral cavity, but we also see this in conjunction with patches in the intestines that I showed you just a little while ago. We can divide these tonsils into three kind of sets of tonsils. We have the pharyngeal tonsils, which are like way up high, kind of in the back, actually, of the nasal cavity. You can see in the diagram up there. I can't quite reach up there to point to it. We have the palatine tonsil, which is in the back of the mouth. And then we have the lingual tonsil, which is kind of on the posterior aspect of your tongue here. You can see those there. I'll show you another diagram. So this is kind of the stylized diagram. If we look at more what an accurate image looks like, we see something that looks like this. And you can see where those tonsils are located in the oral cavity. Now, if you know someone that's had a tonsillectomy, so had their tonsils removed, it was most likely these palatine tonsils, which are the largest, and they can often get infected. And so they have an important role in the immune system, but sometimes the immune system can't quite fight off that infection. And so the bacteria, in many cases, aggregate in these tonsils. And often, especially in kids, you get these like repeated infections where the tonsils just get infected over and over and over again. And at some point, the doctors are like, hey, let's just get rid of this thing. So obviously you can survive and be just fine without them. And that's really all I'm going to say about the tonsils. I want you to know that they are examples of MALT, this mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. I want you to know these three sets of tonsils, pharyngeal, palatine, and lingual, and then just know that they play an important role in the immune system, in that these lymphocytes aggregate there to fight off potential pathogens, I'll say. And that's all we're going to talk about. Tonsils, tonsil questions, tonsil thoughts? Yes.
Do we just need to know what the tonsils are, or do you think we're going to need to label?
I want you to make sure you know the pharyngeal. Sorry, the text got a little cut there. The L should be up at the end there, so it should be pharyngeal tonsil, not pharyngia L tonsil. I don't know how that happened. Palatine and lingual. So you should be able to label a diagram that looks like this, and you should be able to know them from the lateral view here as well. Does that answer your question, Tara? Yeah, cool. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, it's on. You can, the way it's imaged here, it's like, it's actually like back down. It's kind of, imagine if this part of the tongue is transparent. You know, if you like really pull your tongue up with like this depressor, you can kind of see the edge of it there. So it's kind of on the most posterior and inferior aspect of your tongue, kind of around the back. Cool. All right, let's go ahead and talk about, I'm going to jump around a little bit. Since we're talking about this MALT, this mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, I'm going to jump down and talk about some other examples of this associated with the digestive system. So, as I mentioned, the tonsils are an example of this MALT. So are these lymphoid nodules and your appendix that are associated with your small intestine, and well, both small intestine and large intestine in the case of appendix. So these, this tissue is derived from your mesoderm, just like your spleen and lymph nodes. We haven't talked too much about this development, but at the beginning of this semester, you might remember we talked about those three primary germ layers: ectoderm on the outside, mesoderm in the middle, endoderm on the inside. The MALT is derived from the mesoderm. And its job, as I mentioned, is to fight invading bacteria. And so you can imagine that your body is exposed to bacteria all the time, but primary places where they might enter your body are through your mouth, and that could be through eating or drinking or breathing, as well as then if that gets into your digestive system, it will travel through your digestive system. And so these tissues fight potential infections that have entered the body through the digestive system. This tissue generates a wide range of memory lymphocytes. So remember, those memory lymphocytes are lymphocytes that are basically primed to respond to specific antibodies. And so when they encounter those antibodies, then they're activated. But until then, they just kind of are at the ready. We have the two primary examples of MALT associated with the digestive system I want to talk about is this aggregated lymphoid nodule. You'll see these referred to as Peyer's patches sometimes. And this is in the end part, the distal part of the small intestine. And then we have the appendix, which is this little guy that dangles off the end of your cecum, which is part of your large intestine. You'll see this on our cat, our last lab. So a week from tomorrow, we dissect the cats to get into the digestive system. And one of the things you'll be doing is identifying the appendix. You'll be able to see that. Now, the appendix is often referred to as like this kind of vestigial organ that played a more prominent role in our ancestors, and we don't really use it, but it's still part of our body because there hasn't been selection against it. But it's not really true. The appendix actually plays an important role for us now in immune response, but also especially in the past. So our ancestors ate a lot more, were exposed to a lot more bacteria through their food than we are, because we have a lot of ways to clean our food, either through modern irradiation processes or microwaves or cooking, often everything. We eat a lot less bacteria. So back in the day, your ancestors had a lot more diarrhea and vomiting than you do now, which is great to think about us not having that as much. But the problem with diarrhea isn't just that there's a lot of problems with diarrhea. One, it sucks and super painful. I didn't need to tell you that. But also you lose a lot of water and you lose a lot of potential nutrients that are flushed out of the digestive system. But what you don't think about is the gut flora, that the microorganisms that live in our digestive system, those also get flushed out. And we have the very close symbiotic relationship with those microorganisms that is the subject of a whole other class. The important thing is you don't want to lose all of those so-called good bacteria, because then you can be invaded by so-called bad bacteria. Now, it's not quite that simple, but the idea being that we have these bacteria that we want in our gut. So what happens when you would get diarrhea is you flush all that out and you lose all those bacteria. Well, the appendix was basically this little sac where a lot of those bacteria could stay. Even as you had diarrhea, you flushed everything out, you'd have this little colony of bacteria that would stay there, and then they could from there divide and repopulate your gut after you had a terrible bout of diarrhea, after you had cholera or whatever. Now, obviously that still happens today in a lot of places in the world. We're pretty fortunate here in the US that a lot of the diseases that cause these kinds of digestive issues aren't as prominent, but they do still exist. And all of us at some point in our life, I'm sure, have had a bout of stomach bug or something like that. You can thank your appendix for holding on to some bacteria to help you repopulate your gut. Go ahead, Sophie. You mean by ingesting stuff? Yeah. You can. There's actually pretty mixed evidence for that, from my understanding. Like, you hear a lot about so-called probiotics, yogurts and stuff like that. My understanding is the latest I've read is that like it doesn't hurt you at all, but really those bacteria don't really end up repopulating your gut. You just kind of end up digesting most of them anyway. Where we get a lot of these bacteria from are actually from our moms when we're newborns. We get it through our moms through close interactions with our moms, both physically, so through breastfeeding. Gets us a lot of those bacteria. And then also during, this is interesting actually, during vaginal birth, you get a lot of those bacteria colonize your body and your passageway out of the mom's body. And then those bacteria live in you for the rest of your life, basically. And so what they're actually doing now is kind of cool. For babies that are born via C-section, where the baby doesn't exit through the birth canal and so isn't exposed to these bacteria, they actually take like swabs of the mucosa from the mom's birth canal and inoculate the baby with that, so they have a chance to be exposed to these bacteria. It's kind of cool.
Is that one of the reasons why it's bad to like keep your baby like too, like, you know, trying to clean your baby too often?
Yeah, the so-called what's it called, the hygiene hypothesis that our over cleanliness has led to an increase in allergies and asthma and things like that. Yeah, there's some evidence for that for sure, that like basically our immune systems are primed to be responding to things from the outside world. Like back in the day, we used to live in much closer proximity to animals and livestock and all this kind of stuff. In that now, since we're not exposed to that, our immune systems are like, well, I need to do something, and so they end up like over responding to, you know, things that aren't harmful, like getting in and you get allergies and things like that. That's a hypothesis that has support, but not like total support from my understandings. Yeah, it's cool stuff. Actually, this kind of thing I think is really fascinating. To answer your question, Sophie? Yeah, good questions. Sure. Other questions on this? Kylie, your hand's up? No. Okay, cool. All right, so this is what some of these Pyrus patches look like. I'm not gonna show you a microscope slide and ask you to identify the structures, but I just want you to see what these look like in conjunction with the intestinal wall. We have the smooth muscle here lining the intestinal wall. We have these patches of lymphoid tissue, and then we have the mucous membrane and the endothelium associated with the digestive system there. And we haven't really gotten into this microstructure of the digestive system. We'll encounter this a little bit in lab in a couple weeks, but I just want you to see how these nodes are kind of integrated right into the wall of the intestine, basically between the smooth muscle and the lumen of the intestine where the food and everything is coming. So you can get some disorders associated with some of these. Actually, do I want to get into this? Yeah, let's just talk about some of these disorders really quickly. A couple things that can go wrong with these systems include something called chylothorax, which doesn't sound fun, that's for sure. This is when some of that fatty lymph that is being transported directly from the intestine into your bloodstream leaks out into your thorax. So basically you get a bunch of like fat floating around in your thorax, which can cause trouble. We have something called lymphangitis, is when some of these lymph vessels can get swollen. Mononucleosis is a viral disease that's caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. And you've probably heard of this, often referred to as the kissing disease. It's transmitted through kind of salivary contact, among other forms. And basically, it just keeps you feel really run down for a whole bunch of weeks. And this virus, it does this by attacking some of those B lymphocytes. So those lymphocytes that matured in the bone marrow, this particular virus attacks them. You've probably heard of that. Hodgkin's lymphoma is when you get a type of cancer of your lymph nodes. And then non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is a different form where you have this, it's a cancer of the lymphocytes the developing lymphocytes before they differentiate. And so a couple different forms of lymphoma or cancer of the lymph nodes. You've probably heard those phrases as well. Hodgkin's lymphoma, are both of them? Hold on, I might get this mixed up. I can't remember if at least one of these is pretty treatable. I don't remember if both of them are. Does anyone know off the top of their head if they're both pretty treatable yet? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, yeah. So this one, and there's a pretty good success rate for treating them. So I want to acknowledge here, I have this slide of disorders. This is immune disorders, but also kind of going back to the lymphatic system a little bit, talking about cancers of the lymph nodes. Lymphangitis is when those lymph vessels themselves become inflamed. And then I guess these are actually more disorders associated with the lymph system than the immune system, but there's a lot of overlap there. And that's all I'm going to talk about with, wait, we didn't get to the spleen, did we? Where's my slide on the spleen? Oh, wait, did we cover the spleen last Friday? Or was Friday before? Sorry, give me 1 second to sort myself out here. I apologize. I lost a couple slides. That's why this one feels a little out of order to me then. Okay, if you excuse me for 1 second, I just want to go back and grab a couple slides here. Oh, we didn't talk about the thymus either, did we? How did I miss all these slides? Okay. Well, all right, I'm going to bounce back and get to the thymus and the spleen, and then we'll talk about the endocrine system. Before I do, let me pause here and see what questions you have about what we've covered so far, tonsils and aggregated lymphoid nodules and appendix. Okay, let's talk about the thymus. As you might remember, when we talked about lymphocytes, this is the site where immature lymphocytes that originate in the bone marrow, they migrate to the thymus, and then in the thymus, they develop into these T lymphocytes. The thymus is important for immune function, but also serves as an endocrine organ and secretes thymic hormones. And I'll talk about that a little more when we talk about the endocrine system. What I want you to know is that the thymus plays this dual role. It's immune role and an endocrine role. Interestingly, the thymus is big and prominent and very active when you're young. And as you get older, it gets smaller and does less and less and less. And it atrophies. And in fact, by the time you're an adult, or by the time, I shouldn't say that, by the time you're in your 50s, 60s, it's basically this tiny little shriveled thing, which is a little sad. The thymus structurally is composed of a cortex on the outside and medulla on the inside. And the medulla on the inside contains what's called the thymic corpuscles. I'll show you a diagram of that just on the next slide. What's important to note about the thymus is it is unlike the other lymphoid organs in a couple different ways. One, it doesn't, it functions as a site where these lymphocytes mature into T lymphocytes, but it's not a repository of lymphocytes to fight infection, as is the MALT, as is your lymph nodes, as is your appendix, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, you're not actually fighting infection in the thymus. It's just a spot where these cells mature into these T lymphocytes. Also, the thymus arises from epithelial tissue rather than from the mesoderm, as I said, with the other lymphoid organs. And this has to do with its endocrine function. So endocrine organs generally arise from this epithelial tissue as well. And so because of its dual role between the endocrine and immune systems, it arises from the epithelial tissue. So the thymus looks like this. It's kind of in the upper mediastinum, this cavity here where your heart and your trachea are. You can see it here pretty prominently. Again, I want to show you this micrograph, but don't worry about identifying these structures. The takeaway message is that we have the cortex on the outside, and then we have the medulla on the inside, as with so many other structures in the body. And we have these thymic corpuscles. I always have a hard time saying that word, corpuscles. And the thymic corpuscles are where the action happens. That's where these T cells mature, or the lymphocytes mature into T lymphocytes. So by the time you're about 20 years old, you still have about 80% of your thymus. It's about 85% functional. By the age of 40, it's about 5%. So my thymus is going to be much, much tinier than all of yours, most likely. And by the time you're older than that, it gets to be just a tiny, tiny little thing. Here.
Why is that?
As I was saying that, I was wondering to myself the same thing. Like, I mean, the part of the answer would be that it's not as necessary to have this place to have these T cells mature when you get older. Why that is the case, I don't know. Let me look into that and get back to you. It's a good question. Tia? Yeah. So you have okay, let me think about this for a second. You retain some that matured when you were young, but what's the lifespan of those two? Let me get back to you on that question. Like where, if they're not maturing in the thymus, where you're getting those T lymphocytes from when you're older. I don't know that. I have a guess, but let me confirm it and get back to you on that. Those are really good questions. Go ahead, Sophie. Absolutely. Let me go back here. This one? Yep. Okay, cool. Okay, so this is a bit of a reminder. We talked about the lymph nodes earlier, but I've kind of mentioned them a few times. So I wanted to just come back and show you this slide again. Remember that these lymph nodes are kind of nodes along the path of the lymph vessels that are draining lymph from the connective tissue back into the bloodstream. And this is a site where B and T lymphocytes are activated by antigens. So they come into contact with these potentially harmful molecules and they're activated, initiating this immune response. And so this is a place where you have these immune cells hanging out, ready to fight infection. That's the takeaway message. Whereas in the thymus, those cells are maturing, but they're not actually fighting infection in your thymus. That happens in your lymph nodes and in the malt and some other places. All right, one more lymphoid organ. Let's talk about your spleen. That's this guy right here, kind of on the left side, lateral to your stomach, just inferior to your left lung. And it is the largest of your lymphoid organs. And it has, it does a couple different things, right? One of the things it does is it's highly vascularized. There's lots of blood going through here. And part of what it does is it removes antigens from the blood so that those can be attacked, I'll say, by the immune cells. And not only that, but it also removes old or defective red blood cells from circulation. So it's basically making sure that your blood cells are, it's getting rid of the old non-functional cells, is what I'm trying to say. When you are developing in uterus, it's also the site of hematopoiesis, which is the formation of those red blood cells. However, when you're an adult, those red blood cells are made in your bone now. But when you're a fetus, that's where they originate. So it has important functions for both red blood cells and as well as a lymphoid organ. So let's take a look at that in a little more detail. Here is actual spleen. You can see the diaphragm arching above here. The diaphragm, of course, is that muscle associated with breathing that you'll see in your cats the week after next. You can see it situated here kind of like right on top of the kidney. And so a couple important notes about the spleen. It's a very active organ, so it's doing a lot of things. However, you can live without your spleen. If it becomes infected and need to remove it, you can still do okay without it. So the immune system, as you can see, is very, very redundant, meaning there's lots of different places where infections are being fought. And so if you remove one or even two of those places, there's still other ways for your bodies to fight infections. So you can get rid of your tonsils, you can get rid of your spleen, you can get rid of your appendix, et cetera, and you can still generally do what you need to do. So here, the spleen, as I mentioned, pulls these antigens out of circulation from the bloodstream so they can be attacked by these immune cells. And so because these B lymphocytes are interacting with these antigens, they mature into those plasma cells that fight infections. I showed that kind of sequence of events earlier, I think last Wednesday before break. Bless you. So and in addition to fighting bacteria, as I mentioned, we also are cleaning out old red blood cells, old white blood cells, which are immune cells, and platelets. So basically these cells in your blood that are no longer functional are getting pulled out of circulation from your spleen. And also you store platelets here. We haven't talked about platelets, but platelets are basically a component of the blood that clogs your blood, or that's not the word I want to use, clots your blood when you have an open wound. So that's why if you get a cut and you start bleeding within a few minutes, if not seconds, that bleeding generally stops, and that you've begin to form that blood clot, so it doesn't kind of continuously bleed and eventually forms a scab, etc. There's two internal structures of the spleen I want you to know, and that is the red pulp and the white pulp. And so you can see a cross section of the spleen here with some other structures. What I want you to know just very generally is you can see on this diagram, and actually you can see this in real life as well, is that the red pulp looks pretty reddish and the white pulp looks pretty white, which is nice. The red pulp we can think of as the primary site where those blood cells are being taken out of circulation and disposed of, and whereas the white pulp is more primarily associated with immune function and dealing with those antigens, right? So we have red and white pulp, easy to remember, red pulp, red blood cells, and then white pulp, we think of white blood cells as the immune cells, so that's where the immune function takes place. And I have one more. Yeah, I'll just show you one more slide of this. This is another micrograph. Again, I don't need you to be able to identify these, but I just want you to be able to see these structures, what they actually look like microscopically. And you can see the takeaway message here is red and white pulp are kind of distributed within one another. So especially the white pulp is kind of surrounded by this red pulp. And you can see this in a cross section here. This is kind of a transverse section. You can see this kind of a ring of white pulp in this larger structure of the red. Yeah, that's all we need to say about that. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about the spleen. We'll see the spleen in your cats too. The spleen is pretty prominent. Actually, the spleen, no, the spleen is pretty prominent. Should be able to see that without any problem. Good on the spleen? All right, so I'm going to close that. Go there. All right, let's go ahead and talk about transitions, get started on the endocrine system. So there's two primary systems by which your body essentially communicates with itself, where information is moved from one part of your body to the other. We spent a lot of time studying the nervous system, which is the first of those two systems. The second is the endocrine system. The endocrine system performs some of that same function in terms of communication across your body, but it does so in a very different way. And I want to talk about the structures associated with how the endocrine system works. Of course, we can take a whole course on the endocrine system. We're just going to kind of do a general overview of the anatomical structures associated with it. So we have three basic parts. We have ductless glands that are dispersed throughout the body that secrete special chemicals called hormones. I should have put this in like red and bold and underlined and circled it. This is a super important word. Hormones are simply chemicals that messenger chemicals, I'll call them. And so we have these glands throughout the body that excrete hormones into the bloodstream, and those chemicals are called hormones. The second component of your endocrine system is the hormones themselves, these chemical messengers. And the third thing is the organs where those hormones send their message. So the hormones originate in the glands, They then travel through the bloodstream, and then they bring a message to target organs. And target organs are essentially everything in your body, every organ in your body has receptors for different hormones. Now, what's interesting is that different organs have different receptors to respond to different hormones. So they don't all respond to the same hormones, even though those hormones are all circulating in your blood. So your kidney responds to different hormones, for example, than your gonads, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got glands, hormones, target organs. And let us then take a look at some of the major endocrine glands in the body. Let me see how I want to present this. Yep, okay. So I'm going to show you a set of those glands to start that are purely hormonal. So their only function is with the endocrine system. And this includes your pineal gland, which remember is part of what part of your brain? Hypothalamus, good. We have, and the hypothalamus is part of what larger structure of the brain? Diencephalon, good, okay. Now we've got the pituitary gland, we talked about that. That's associated with what other part of the diencephalon? Good. Note that it's associated with the hypothalamus, but it's not part of the hypothalamus. It's separate from the hypothalamus. It's connected by this little tube called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland sits in a particular structure in the sphenoid bone, which is called the soleus cervicis. Good. We talked about that in the skull unit. We then have the thyroid gland. So, and the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are these little glands that are kind of embedded in the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is this kind of butterfly-shaped gland, just anterior to your trachea. And then we have your adrenal glands. This is where adrenaline is produced. So norepinephrine, epinephrine, as well as corticosterone, hormones associated with the stress response, etc. So we've got those structures. Then we have some other structures that are hormonal, but not exclusively hormonal. So they perform other functions as well. So this includes the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain. So it performs, or it has a nervous system component to it as well. The thymus, as I just mentioned, is a hormone or endocrine organ, but also associated with immune function. Your pancreas, which produces hormone, but also produces enzymes important for digestion. And then we have our gonads, which are hormonal, largely hormonal organs, but also play other important roles in terms of reproduction. So those are the other structures. Go ahead, Kai. Sure. Let me see here. This one? Sure. Do you have a question about it, or you just want to get some notes down? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, I'm going to go back here, get all of these guys back up. We also have other organs that primarily perform other functions, but do secrete some hormones. And this includes your heart, your digestive tract itself, your kidney, and even your skin. So these are structures that primarily are associated with other functions. You know, for example, the heart obviously is the pump that circulates your blood, but also, bless you, the heart produces hormones as well. So what I want to talk about first is, what I'm going to do is walk through these hormones and just give you a general outline of a little more detail of their structure and their function. I'm going to start off with the cephalic endocrine glands. So cephalic meaning head. So these are the endocrine glands associated with the, I guess, brain explicitly, including the pituitary and the pineal gland, and then a few others, and then we'll work on from there. So the pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. Those words are interchangeable. And the hypophysis hangs out in this little groove here, the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, as you know. Let me see here. I'll show you. Just by way of review, you can see the pituitary here in relation to a bunch of other stuff you know. So the corpus callosum, of course, is white matter that's connecting your left and right cerebral hemispheres. We have the fourth ventricle filled with cerebrospinal fluid. We have the pineal body here associated with the epithalamus. We have your hypothalamus here. You can see your brain stem kind of coming down here. So this is going to be your midbrain right up here, et cetera, et cetera. I've got a bunch of question marks there. See if you can, actually, let's do this. What do we got for time? Yeah, take a minute. I don't have a timer set up, but take a minute and talk to someone next to you and see if you can name 1, 2, 3, 4 of those question marks. I think all of these you covered in your brain lab. All right, so there we have the interthalamic adhesion. So remember, your thalamus is 2 hemispheres like your cerebrum. You've got this little spot here where they're connected in the middle. Then on the posterior of your midbrain, you have the superior and inferior colliculi. Those are those paired. So remember, there's 2 superior and 2 inferior colliculi. What else was the question mark? Oh, mammillary body here. Remember this from your brain dissection in the lab. It's this structure that protrudes down just posterior from your hypothalamus there. And then the other one, the optic chiasma. Remember, this is where those optic nerves cross. And we're looking at it in the sagittal plane. So it looks like this kind of bulb that's hanging down, but really there's like an optic nerve that's kind of coming out of the screen this way. But when we cut it sagittally, it just looks like a little thing that's protruding just kind of superior and anterior to the pituitary. Let me see what time we have. Actually, I think I'm going to stop there and skip ahead to just some announcements and logistics and things like that. Before I do, what questions do you have for me? I do have a ticket out for you today. Let's actually do this. Okay, so just some notes on our upcoming schedule. We have 2 weeks of class left. We have 1 more quiz. It's going to take similar format to previous quizzes. It'll be closed book and on paper, and it will cover the lymphatic, immune, and endocrine systems, and we'll be in class a week from today. So we've got a bunch of stuff to cover, these kind of short units on these 3 systems, and that'll be a week from today. And then you have 1 more exam, and that will be the same format as previous exams as well. It's going to be Blackboard, open book. This will cover everything from the brain. So the brain, lymphatic system, immune system, endocrine system, and respiratory system, which we haven't covered yet, but we will. And it's going to be open for a couple days. I want to do it on the last day of class. And just like the previous exams, we'll have it instead of class. So we won't meet on that Friday. Instead, you'll have all day to complete the exam in Blackboard. And I'll keep it open through Saturday as well, just to give you more flexibility with your schedule. So we won't have class on that Friday. And I should have been clear here. This is Friday, December 9th. I mean, the very last day. So our last day of class will be Wednesday, December. Just as a reminder, I don't have it on the slide, but our lab practical will be during the final exam period, which is on Tuesday, the 13th, yes, in the morning. And I'll provide details of that coming up, but make sure you keep that block, that final exam time open for that. Yes, Abby.
So we're all gonna be in the lab room, like we're not gonna be split by our lab.
That's what I'm trying to figure out exactly how to do this best logistically, and I will share that information with you guys soon. So keep that whole block of time open, and then we'll figure out what's best, because we have 18 of us. We could probably do it at the same time, actually. I need to figure out exactly. I'll let you know. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, I've got the slide. We didn't get to talk about Andre the Giant or Missy Elliott today, so this meme probably doesn't make as much sense, but you know. Reminder, your lab guide is now available for lab tomorrow. It's on the heart. Please do look it over in advance of lab tomorrow. That's on your class program as well. Also remember that you have those brain quizzes in visible body from our last lab that are due by the start of lab tomorrow. So if you haven't done those yet, I think most of you have those in. If you haven't done those yet, remember those are due by tomorrow. Danny's got a tutoring session today from 4 to 5 in the lab room. And then on Thursday again this week, please note that. I have open hours only from 1 to 2 today because there is a candidate for, we're hiring a new neuroscientist. And the candidate is giving a teaching demonstration from noon to 1 or 12:10 to 1 in the Science Center. If you're interested in that, it'd be great to get your feedback and meet a potential new professor. It is open to students. So if you're interested, especially those of you that are neuroscience oriented, I definitely encourage you to go and check it out. So I know Matt, that's you. Who else is neuroscience oriented? Julia, yeah, it might be cool to check it out. So yeah, I want to make sure that information is there. Otherwise, here's your ticket out. Thank you, everybody. I will see you in lab tomorrow.